Sinister stories, presents, the zoo's darkest secret. If you've been to the zoo before, you might remember the feeling of seeing majestic animals like lions and tigers, only to watch them lounge around, barely moving. When I was a kid, I expected roars and prowling, but they mostly just lay around yawning. As a child, it was disappointing. It seemed as though these powerful creatures had lost their wild edge. But here's the thing, many of them are nocturnal. Seeing them at night is a completely different experience, one I was lucky enough to witness firsthand. I've worked as a zookeeper for almost 6 years now, mainly doing night shifts to avoid disrupting the daytime guests. After all, who wants to visit the zoo only to see a tiger tranquilized for a checkup? Most of my shift involves making rounds, inspecting enclosures, and recording the animals' behaviors in my logbook, especially anything unusual. The zoo takes on a whole new vibe after hours, with all the animals I thought were lazy and calm during the day turning active and fierce at night. The big cats especially come to life. Male animals often growl and fight each other, and some of the big cats seem to watch me with a hunger that's unsettling. Their pens are usually littered with food, but it's like they're saving their appetite for something more interesting. I've never actually felt afraid, but passing by those enclosures and seeing so many eyes glinting at me from the darkness is definitely unsettling, even though I know the fences are strong enough to keep them contained. During my free time, I got to know some of the night guards. Their job is mostly to keep teens from sneaking in after hours, but we often shared stories and rumors about the zoo. The place has a long history. It was originally built in the 19th century to store circus animals. Given its remote location in a small town in Nevada, it's easy to believe the bizarre tales the guards would share with me. They told me about accidents that supposedly happened over the years, like the time a worker feeding the crocodiles slipped and ended up as part of their meal, or the story of a night manager who accidentally let a grizzly bear loose. Apparently, it went on a rampage in the zoo and even made it into town, injuring people before the police finally managed to shoot it down. But the strangest story was the one about animals disappearing in the middle of the night. This rumor especially caught my attention, not only because the guards told it with conviction, but because this phenomenon was actually recorded in the logbooks by previous night managers. Oddly enough, I encountered this myself within my first month of working there, when a monkey went missing between my initial and second routine checks of the night. I figured it had somehow escaped, so I reported it to the head manager in the morning, only to be told not to worry. I found that strange, but brushed it off since the guards seemed to think it might be a ghost or something supernatural. As time passed, I noticed this phenomenon continued. More animals went missing systematically, yet management never seemed bothered. Even the disappearance of an elderly lion didn't raise any alarms. It got me thinking that maybe management was hiding something. I started to wonder if these animals weren't disappearing on their own, but instead were being deliberately removed by management, possibly to avoid the expense and paperwork involved with euthanizing old or unpopular animals. When I shared this theory with the night guards, we joked about it, saying that maybe the zoo had a secret program to take care of the animals nobody wanted around. Months turned into years, and the disappearances kept happening. Each missing animal would eventually be replaced, usually by a younger one, as if it had never happened. Meanwhile, I was settling into my routine, getting faster at my rounds, until I had nearly an hour of free time before the end of my shift. I'd usually spend that time with the guards, but even though we had fun, we never stopped wondering about the mysterious disappearances. One night, I finally decided to find out for myself. It had been eating away at me every time an animal vanished, and I couldn't stand the curiosity anymore. I was doing an early night inspection at the zebra pen when I noticed one was missing. Normally, I'd just make a note of it and move on, but something about this disappearance felt different. I decided to walk around the pen, just to take a quick look and see if anything was out of place. When I reached the far corner of the enclosure, I saw something unusual moving in the distance. Through the dim light, I could see a large, dark figure lumbering through the underbrush, dragging something behind it. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. It definitely wasn't a zebra, but whatever it was, it seemed to be carrying something large and heavy. It didn't take long to realize that it was hauling the missing zebra. I left my clipboard on the ground, quickly climbed over the fence, and quietly followed the figure from a distance. It didn't notice me, and after a few moments, I realized we were headed toward a strange building I'd spotted once or twice before. The building had always seemed odd to me, as it didn't appear on any of the zoo maps, had no paths leading to it, and was tucked away in an obscure corner. I could only see it from one specific angle near the edge of the zoo grounds. I had tried asking about it before, but my boss always brushed off my questions. I joked with the guards that maybe the building was some kind of hidden animal breeding chamber, or even a place where management conducted experiments. The more I thought about it, though, the more I suspected that it was somehow linked to the missing animals. Now, seeing this figure dragging a zebra toward the building, I started to feel like my theory might be true. When we got closer, I finally got a better look at the structure. It was made entirely of concrete, with no windows or exterior markings. The building looked more like a bunker than anything else. As we approached, a single security light flickered on, illuminating the figure as he stopped at a solid steel door. I could see now that he had a tranquilizer gun slung over his shoulder and wore an old stained lab coat that had turned a dingy brown. He knocked 4 times, and after a few moments, I heard a mechanical whirring as the door slowly swung open. The figure slipped inside with the zebra, and I bolted toward the door, slipping in just before it closed behind me. As the heavy door locked with a loud click, I felt a rush of adrenaline. I'd never snuck into a restricted area before, let alone one with such a mysterious purpose. Inside, the place was as strange and eerie as I'd imagined. It was filled with sterile, bleak hallways, lined with strong metal doors, each one with a small window covered in wire mesh. I followed the figure down one of the hallways, keeping to the shadows to avoid being seen. After a few turns, he stopped at one of the doors and shoved the zebra through. Another man, this one in a clean lab coat, with a clipboard, came out of the room and closed the door behind him. The man with the tranquilizer crossed his arms and said, "I hope you're making progress, Doctor. They warned me we can't keep taking test subjects like this anymore. People are starting to ask questions. If you don't show some results soon, they might cut you from the program." The other man, who I assumed was a scientist, muttered something I couldn't hear. The two walked down the hall and disappeared behind a set of swinging doors, leaving me alone. Curious and disturbed, I crept down the hallway, peeking through each of the windows. Every room was like a concrete cell, and many of them held animals. The sight was horrific. Most of the animals looked like they were starving, lying on the floor, panting heavily. Their bodies were covered in bruises and scars, and some of them had injuries that looked fresh. A few were missing their eyes entirely. As I moved from cell to cell, the condition of the animals worsened. Some of the cells held only the remains of animals, small puddles of thick, black goo that bubbled and oozed as if alive. Eventually, I reached the door where the zebra had been taken. The walls in that room were stained a darker shade than the other cells, as if something had been scrubbed off in a hurry. Anger and disgust welled up in me. I couldn't believe the cruelty I was witnessing, yet at the same time I felt a strange curiosity urging me to go further. Through the swinging doors I entered a long hallway. Voices echoed from a room at the far end, and as I approached, I recognized the voice of the man with the tranquilizer. I peered around the corner and saw a large glass window overlooking a lab room. Inside, a scientist was preparing to conduct an experiment on a massive, hairless rat. The man with the tranquilizer and a few others sat in folding chairs, watching intently. "It had better work this time," the man with the tranquilizer said, sounding impatient. The scientist adjusted his glasses and replied, "According to my calculations, the transfusion of these foreign cells should result in a functional, symbiotic relationship." He pulled out a syringe filled with a thick, dark fluid and injected it into the rat's neck. The rat immediately started convulsing, black sludge oozing from its mouth and ears as dark blotches appeared across its skin. It screeched and thrashed around before collapsing in a puddle of bubbling tar. The scientists watched in silence, waiting for something to happen. The rat lay still, coated in the black, tar-like substance. At first it looked like the experiment had failed, and the scientists seemed disappointed. But then, to everyone's surprise, the creature began to twitch. Slowly it lifted its head, its mouth opening and closing, as if gasping for air. Even though its eyes were completely covered in sludge, it somehow seemed aware of its surroundings. "Well, this looks promising," one of the scientists said. "But how long is its lifespan?" The scientists behind the glass began discussing the expected survival rate, but none of them noticed the rat pressing itself against the bars of its cage. Suddenly, the black sludge on its body began to melt off, dripping through the cage bars and creeping across the floor toward the scientist. It wasn't until the cold, slimy substance reached his shoes that he realized what was happening. He screamed, trying to shake it off, but the sludge seemed to grip onto his legs, crawling upward. The other scientists panicked. One shouted, "Seal the room!" The man with the tranquilizer gun jumped up and began locking the scientist inside the lab chamber, muffling his screams as the black slime engulfed his face. At that moment, I knew it was time to leave. I turned and sprinted down the hallway, adrenaline kicking in as I heard glass shattering behind me. The sounds of chaos echoed through the halls, with a deep guttural roar mixed with panicked screams. I bolted through the animal containment area, but when I reached the doors, I realized they'd been locked remotely. Panic surged as I heard the creature crashing through the lab, destroying everything in its path. I ran through the maze of concrete cells, finally ducking into a storage warehouse lined with shelves and cabinets. I hid behind a large filing cabinet, trembling as the noise grew closer. From my hiding spot, I noticed jars and vials filled with grotesque specimens suspended in liquid, faces with twisted expressions, eerie half-dissolved animals floating in preservatives. Desperate for a way out, I scanned the room and spotted a steel door with a handle and keyhole. This one looked more promising than the other doors, which were locked tight. I edged toward it, but the scratching and shuffling sounds from the creature were now in the warehouse with me. Its raspy breathing filled the air, and the smell of rot grew stronger as it neared. I crouched low, trying to stay silent, but the creature's footsteps stopped right in front of the filing cabinet. It sniffed the air, as if trying to locate me. I held my breath, pressing myself against the cabinet and praying it wouldn't notice me. Suddenly, something seemed to catch its attention, and it bolted out of the room toward the animal containment area, perhaps drawn by the scent of the larger animals locked inside. Taking my chance, I ran to the steel door and tried the handle. It was locked, heart pounding. I banged on the door, shouting for help. Just then, I heard the creature smashing through the enclosures, its victims' desperate squeals echoing down the hallway. Realizing I was trapped, I banged on the door again, yelling even louder. In a sudden miracle, the door opened. I scrambled through, barely managing to shut it as the creature lunged at me. It slammed into the door, rattling it as it tried to break through. I turned and saw the head night guard standing there, his face pale and his hand shaking. He caught his breath, locking the door with a master key and explaining he hadn't seen me all night. When I didn't show up in the lounge, he went looking for me and found my clipboard near the zebra pen. Suspecting something was wrong, he took a back route into the building, hearing my frantic banging as he approached. I was too shaken to respond. I sprinted past him, straight to my car, and drove home, vowing never to return. The following morning, I forced myself to go back to the zoo to formally quit. As I arrived, I saw a massive construction crew swarming around the mysterious building. Cement trucks lined the perimeter, and workers were pouring concrete down the chimneys, sealing off the entire structure. Men in suits stood nearby, watching intently, as if overseeing a delicate operation. One of them noticed me and shot a menacing look my way, like a bully warning someone not to speak. I quickly averted my eyes and continued toward the zoo offices. When I found my manager, he fired me on the spot, saying it was for irresponsible behavior. I didn't even bother to ask for details. I just wanted out of there. As I left, I glanced back at the building one last time. It was completely abandoned, with only the drying concrete showing that anyone had been there. My stomach churned as I thought about the horrors I had witnessed inside. I jumped the fence near the zebra pen, feeling compelled to go back to the door I had escaped from the night before. The fear returned as I placed my ear against the door, wondering if the creature had somehow survived the cement. At first there was only silence, but then I heard a faint muffled roar from deep within the concrete tomb. The sound sent chills down my spine. I still don't know what that creature was, but I pray it stays sealed inside that building forever. If it ever breaks free, I have no doubt that it would be a disaster. Since then, I've had constant nightmares, and therapy is starting to sound like a good idea. I'll never go back to that zoo, even though I used to love the job, the night guards, and the quiet life it provided. On the bright side, I heard our local Starbucks is hiring. Maybe surviving a monster attack will look good on a resume.